Well, hello there, and welcome to Rediscovering Your Passion and Purpose with Patty. I am Patty Stuhlin, and I am the Chief Pathfinder of Pathways with Patty. Well, my guest today is Rebecka Eggers. She is a dream midwife, brand storyteller, meditation improv artist, and published author. She works with people on how to deal with the chaos of exponential change through creativity. She loves working with the passionate warriors who are dedicated to becoming future makers, delivering the next level inventions, innovations, and other solutions for the challenges the world is facing now and tomorrow. Hello, Rebecka. How you doing?
Hi, Patty. I'm good. Happy Dia de los Muertos.
Oh, and please tell everybody why that is even more significance based on where you are doing this podcast recording from.
Yeah, I'm recording from Chiapas, Mexico, in the mountainous highlands of the southern part of Mexico along the Guatemalan border.
Awesome. Well, it is a pleasure having you here today. How are you doing overall? Good?
Good. Excited to be here and have this conversation.
Wonderful. When you and I had our initial talk, I was really I was really inspired by your story. I was also very intrigued with your story and the things that you are doing with other people. So with that said, how about telling our audience pretty much your story of, where you've been, where you're going, and where you are, and where you plan on going in the future?
Okay, well, let's just start out with the fact that I have 12 years of experience in the personal and business development area. I started my career in this area by becoming ordained as a metaphysical minister. I became a Reiki master, and I got training as a life coach. So I have a lot of technical training in this area, but I have a lot more what you would call in the trenches training in this area. So I feel like I bring an interesting perspective to the personal development or business development area, but that's not where I started my career. I started my career as a tax lawyer in some of the largest law firms and one of the largest S&P 500 companies in the world. So I have been in the rooms where big decisions were made on an international level that really went beyond the borders of any one particular country in terms of how money moved around the world, where assets went, who benefited from tax revenues, who didn't, where companies were headquartered. So I know how decisions are made at the top of the financial system. And I've spent the last 12 years at what you might call the bottom of the financial system, which, many people would suggest that Chiapas qualifies for that. It's one of the poorest states in Mexico. It's a place where a lot of resources leave. The costs are often externalized, and the people typically remain impoverished in much of the state, despite, Chiapas having rich resources like, water, for instance, that has been used quite liberally by some of the corporations that are doing business here. So I understand the struggles at the top and I understand the struggles at the bottom. And I would say that there's really not an easy place in any of this.
Can you tell our audience how it is that you went from living in the United States to going to Mexico?
Yes, I've told this story a lot of times, but I'll try and give kind of an abbreviated version of it. I was, working in a big company in the United States, and I came down to Tulum, Mexico for Christmas and New Year's Eve in 2009. So it was becoming 2010. And I had an encounter with a man there who introduced me to the story of the Zapatista rebels here in Chiapas. And I had this instinct that I needed to come to Chiapas, and I had this instinct that the Zapatistas held a key piece of my story that I didn't understand, and that this town, San Cristobal de las Casas, also held a piece of my story. So, yeah, there was romance, it was New Year's Eve, there was a beach, things happened, but,
Yes.
and then there was a romance that kind of went on for a period of time, after that, as I kind of came here and left and came here and left. But that relationship is not ultimately why I wound up in Chiapas. So we can just like be catalyst, bye. So it was
Yes.
fun while it lasted.
Yes.
It was, it was one of those star-crossed moments of life that changes everything, but not for the reasons you expected.
Right.
So when I got here, what I witnessed on the streets here is that there is a great deal of poverty and suffering that is visible. And I had had a lot of trauma in my life, and I had a lot of suffering on the inside of me that didn't feel congruent with the things that were on the outside of my life. American life can look so good on the surface. It can be have very nicely groomed lawns, very perfectly appointed houses, and still have kind of an aching misery. And here, that aching misery found a congruent external environment. And that was really the beginning of exploring not just my trauma, but my own roots, because my grandmother on my mother's side is descended of one native nation, and my grandfather on my mother's side was descended of another. And so I was raised knowing that I was native, but not knowing what that really meant, not understanding what that really meant.
Right.
And it was probably the most interesting way to describe that journey is that a while ago, my husband, who's indigenous, Maya, and I were talking with my grandmother, who recently passed away, and she was in her 90s. And after we finished, he said, the big difference between your grandmother and you is that she's always known that she was native, and you are just figuring out what that means. And the contrast is incredibly powerful to see the difference between your discovery and her understanding.
Wow.
And I think that I have been kind of closing that gap of understanding for the last 12 years. So that's a big part of how I wound up in Chiapas. And it's probably a big part of why I remain in Chiapas. I tried to enroll, but it turns out the people that I'm descended from left, in particular, the Choctaw Nation, without putting their names on the Dawes rolls, which is not uncommon because the nation was being disbanded at that time. So there's really no place to go home to. And I can't speak for any, I'm not speaking for any Native nation. I'm just talking about my journey of trying to understand and heal the intergenerational trauma that I have. One aspect of which is that my own mother was murdered when I was 24.
Oh my goodness.
So I lost all of the connection that I had to that history. So I've just been piecing things together over the last 12 years and discovered that it was a far more significant aspect of my own personal journey than I understood.
Now, does that mean that you did not, after your mother was murdered, does that mean that you did not have much of a relationship with your grandmother to find out more of your history and your culture?
We had never actually had much of a relationship, but before my mother died, I'm kind of losing track of the timeline, but either before or right after, we started to spend time together, and she started to tell me a little bit. And then I moved to Chiapas and life happened, and we started, we kind of lost track of each other. And then, phones got turned off or whatever. And it just happened that we lost track of each other, and I went searching for her. And it turned out she'd been searching for me. So we connected again right before she passed away for her to share more of that information.
It's almost like divine intervention, though, don't you think? That it's kind of like she was coming to the end of her journey, but she was helping you to create the beginning of your journey.
Yeah, I think that's true. And giving me the perspective of what it looked like to just be so confident. There's a lot of controversy in the United States right now about, pretendians and people who are pretending to be native so that they can get benefits of being, inclusion or whatever. And I'm definitely not interested in any of that. And I always speak from the place of being disconnected and actually having nothing to teach you about native culture whatsoever, because I'm in the reconnecting
Right.
my journey. But to have her, be so confident in what she said about herself and what she knew, in the way that she handled any questions that I had, was a whole different perspective, because, at her age, she was almost 100, she may have been 100. She had no concept of any of these cultural issues that are going on now. So she was just confident in who she is.
Right. So so I know you mentioned here just a few moments ago that by going down to Mexico, you did you feel like you were starting to bridge a gap, I think is how you kind of said, where you were matching your outside environment with your inside. Is that kind of how you describe that? So can you tell us a little bit more about what that looked like or what that felt like?
Yeah, I mean, there was just a lot of suffering inside of me. I think I was probably born suffering in some sense. Like, I don't actually remember having a happy childhood. I remember having a lot of confusion. I remember not really fitting in very well. You know, because of that, I had a lot of, early sexual abuse and kind of extreme trauma, drug abuse. And I was just starting to recover from that. My father died when I was 22, and then my mother died, and then I was a mother at 26. So I had a lot of unresolved suffering that, when to feel that suffering and not feel like my environment really matched that. Like, I had, a nice house and a great paying job and a lot of opportunities in the world. But my insides were scrambled from so much trauma, and I didn't even have words for that. So I would say that coming here and for the first time seeing that distress expressed in the environment, it just all of a sudden, like, something clicked into place, and I started to kind of fall apart a little bit at a time. Uh, Something about the congruence of the suffering being real, of knowing, gosh, I'm kind of struggling to put this into words, but the United States is a little bit of a bubble in terms of positioning in the world. So it was a personal awakening, but it was also an awakening to the global situation that was
which because of your job that you held in the United States, that's how you really would see that even more from the United States and going global because of the job that you held, correct?
Yeah, I think that gave me like a stark contrast between the wealth I was navigating through every day and the poverty and the suffering that was happening here. And it created an extra weight to the kind of decisions that are made at the top of the financial system, in terms of the impact that you can have around the world, and that people do have around the world, often without fully contemplating or seeing the consequences of those decisions, I would say.
Right. And saying that you kind of fell apart once you got down to Mexico and relating to how your inside was matching the outside environment, is that due at all? Did you not really ever grieve your parents passing and other, your childhood traumas and stuff? Do you think that that's what was finally starting to come out once you went down to Mexico?
Yeah, I had never had adequate help with that, and I immediately had to shift into supporting my daughter. So I just went from like handling my parents' affairs. It's really wild because they arrested a suspect in the murder again this year after 26 years.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's back.
Oh.
The story's back. I'm great. I'm grateful that we may finally have a trial and an answer.
Mhm.
But it's like I've been living with her murder for longer than I knew her
Right.
point, because
Right.
I'm 50 years old at this point.
Mhm.
So it's a kind of a cyclical interaction with that story.
Mhm.
But no, I had never had adequate help with any of those things, because I went from handling those affairs and being involved with the police department at a very young age in a very tragic circumstances, with no one guiding me except that I had just graduated from law school, to being responsible for a family.
Right.
So I was just always doing the next thing, doing the next thing, doing the next thing. And it took coming here and
Mhm.
connecting with, I don't know, a different version of reality. It was like the Buddha leaving the palace and discovering that
Mhm.
there was a lot of suffering in the world, and
Right.
then wanting to alleviate that suffering in some way. Probably I would theorize, never having asked the Buddha, because it matched something on the inside of him that he couldn't name until he went and saw it.
Mhm.
That's my theory.
So how many years now have you lived in Mexico?
I've lived here for 12 years. For a while, I went back and forth. I spent my vacations here. Um, and the fellow that I was seeing at the time took a photo of half of my face,
Mhm.
and he said, "Now half of your heart will always be here." And I guess that the only way I could make my heart whole is to come back to Chiapas for good. So aside from a brief period of time in San Miguel and Guanajuato, I've been here the whole time.
Do you feel that after these 12 years, do you feel like there is healing that has happened?
Oh goodness. Yeah, like I think I had a lot of irrational exuberance about what was going to happen for me in Chiapas when I started, as everyone does when they start to fulfill a dream. I
Mhm.
wanted to. I originally called what's now the Passion Path, the center, for the fulfillment of dreams, Abundance Full of Grace, the center for the fulfillment of dreams, and
Mhm.
that I didn't know that much about abundance, and I didn't know that much about the fulfillment of dreams. So, that name gave way to the Passion Path, which is more of an active exploration of the journey
Mhm.
that we go on in life. As there's no destination, it's really the journey that matters, and a
Right.
way of engaging that journey. So I have, people started coming to me very early on. Obviously I got therapy. I got help from local practitioners here, but people started coming to me really early on with unresolved trauma, that they had tried every possible modality to resolve what was happening in their lives, and something was happening for them that was so big that they were willing to try something new. And I wasn't advertising for that.
Mhm.
It just started coming to me. So I started developing in the trenches ways of helping people to finally find the release that they were looking for. And then later, I was able to validate those approaches by looking at the science of how trauma functions.
Mhm.
So I developed something called soul reconciliation, which is based largely upon the way that dissociation happens in trauma, and the way that trauma gets stuck in images and sensations, and it's not very easily verbalized. Like, I can say to you, my mother was murdered, but in terms of like, most of that is not something you can actually verbalize
Right.
early in your trauma healing. Like, the
Right.
biggest parts of an event like that
Mhm.
remain unspeakable.
Right.
So the work that I do, or have historically done with trauma, has been geared towards the sensations and the images that are in the brain, more than on verbal processing. And it was very successful. And then, when you sort of like make peace with yourself inside, there's another level at which you're breaking habits.
Mhm.
You're changing the way that you respond to the world. And I also have worked with people a lot in that area. And then there's kind of an ultimate level at which you're like just breaking your consciousness and recreating it. I don't know how else to put it. Because at that level, you're really recreating who you are, or you're getting into a place that's purely creative.
Well, which in a sense is pretty much what you did when you went to Mexico, right? I mean,
broke my consciousness.
you basically went through that same process without realizing that's what you were doing.
Yeah, I broke my understanding of the world.
Yeah,
definitely.
did you found, or did you find initially, and I'm sure it's still, but did you feel like a spiritual connection to that part of Mexico, which you think that brought about all of this healing for you and what you're able to do for and with other people?
Well, I had been working with an Egyptian. So there was a point in time before I moved, before 2009, when it was right around that time that it actually came to a conclusion that they had arrested a suspect in the murder case, and we were on the eve of trial, and they dropped all of the charges, and that sent me into a tailspin because I was expecting to go to trial. And so I went to Maine to kind of recover from that, and I met there a woman who is a priestess, or a high priestess, in the temple of Mahat, which is an Egyptian goddess of justice and cosmic consciousness. So I was working with Mahat and with the priestess to recover from the damage of, I was starting to recover, and I was starting to realize that things were really quite not all right.
Right. Yes.
Because I was just crushed at that time when they dropped all the charges, and then, it all kind of died down. And so I got involved in working with Egyptian alchemy and with Mahat, and I was working with Mahat at the time that I went to Tulum. So I feel like, right before I met this man, this is going to sound a little woo. I don't hear voices really very frequently. Like, this was an outside voice that I felt was like speaking in my head. And it was like telling me that I was going to meet someone that he was near, was the exact way that I heard it in my head. And then I looked into the mirror in this hotel room in Tulum, and for a moment, like, my sense of myself as a person just completely cracked. Like, all of the questions that as women we have: am I pretty enough? I'm in the resort, there's the beach, I'm probably in my bathing suit, I'm looking in the mirror, and I'm asking those questions one second, and the next second I'm a whole person.
Wow.
The best way I can describe it, were like all of those questions of value, and am I good enough, and does this bikini look right, and
yes,
am I going to feel okay on the beach, and whatever I was thinking about just disappeared for a second, and I could see there in the mirror a whole person. And then later that night, I walked into this bar in Tulum, and I looked across the room, and my eyes met the eyes of this gentleman, and that's how it all began. So it's been a really, really long journey of claiming an internal sense of my value, of holding my value within, and of shedding those questions. The instantaneous sort of cracking of of womanhood as I knew it, and the arrival at being the person that I am today. That was like a brief window into something that was going to take a decade to
right. It's not gonna happen overnight.
Right. It's not going to happen overnight. Like, it wasn't going to be stable. Right. But the journey began, and I feel like there's a lot of crossover between Egyptian and indigenous, spirituality, in the what people would call Aztec, but I think the proper word is Mexica, spirituality in the of northern Mexico, and then the Mayan spirituality here, where we have pyramids that are somewhat similar to the pyramids in Egypt. So I feel like on a spiritual plane, there's crossover there. So I think there was a reason, aside from me having to struggle with my own, lack of understanding about the heritage that I had. There was a spiritual reason why this place became the place for the exploration that had to happen.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Now I know that during your job that you had here in the United States, in a sense, it was about helping people, assist people, and now you're kind of doing that same thing. Has that kind of been a running theme throughout your life, or was it just something that it was different when it was your job that you had before, and now it's more of a passion project to help others?
I'm not sure if I was helping anyone when I was a tax lawyer. I mean, I was helping to move money around the world. I was helping to make decisions about where that money went. I was, I was a partnership and corporate tax expert at that point in my life. I'm not sure I was helping anyone. I was helping large corporations do what large corporations do and do it efficiently and do it for their own interests. So I think I was actually living kind of the ultimate selfish life at that point. I was making money. I was, a very skilled professional, but I was longing for something more. And I was also really becoming like, it was becoming untenable to continue stuffing down the things that were trying hard to come up, and there were events that happened at the last job that I had as a tax lawyer that brought up some of that. Not pointing any fingers at the company. There were just things, how trauma is, like things trigger you, and reality, unreality, like it's hard to know what's real and unreal at that point because you're lost in your triggers. And so how you respond to something isn't how the person down the hall responds to it, right? So so there were some catalyst events that happened that ultimately broke me. And I came to Chiapas looking for healing, looking for a place to heal, and looking for an alternative kind of life. And I wanted to start, the Center for the Fulfillment of Dreams. And it just was like a long, long, long road before I was going to be ready to do that, ready to offer. I think I'm at the place now. Like, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today was dealing with, the chaos of exponential change and fulfilling your dreams in this environment, and creativity and the role that it's going to play going forward. Because I think all of this trauma stuff, like, boy, we've got to get out of it. Like, we've just got to, we can't spend another, like, we as individual people, but also as a collective, we just can't sit around spending the next 10 or 20 years on making peace with ourselves. Like, everything's got to be on kind of an accelerated track at this point, because things are changing so rapidly. And the one thing that I can say about trauma is it's like this. It's a tight grip on things. It's a circular, it just goes in, a loop. The Ouroboros always sort of eating its own tail. I think of that as the perfect representation of what happens in a trauma cycle. Because in a trauma cycle, you never actually make a move that takes you outside of the cycle. So it just runs along in the same track forever. And you're just constantly eating your own tail. And in a sense, it's harmonious change because it doesn't ever actually challenge the system of trauma in our personal lives or globally. So now we're in this situation where exponential change is happening, especially in the area of technology, and most people are not equipped to deal with that. So I actually have kind of an urgent message for anyone who's listening about the work that has to happen at this point in order for us as human beings to move through and with the things that are evolving now.
And so I know, like in the introduction, that it talks about how you help people to deal with chaos of exponential change through creativity. Can you give us an example of what that means?
Yeah, so I think we have to back up and say, okay, what is exponential change? Because I think most people are used to thinking of linear change. So you make 30 steps, you've literally moved 30 feet roughly, right? But
Yes.
but with exponential change, it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? It's 1, 2, 4, 8. And
Okay.
so the example that I use is like a lily pad that doubles every day. Before you know it, like the whole pond is covered with that lily pad. And we're there with technological change that started in the early 1900s. And for a while, it was doubling at such a small, increment like 0.01, 0.02, 0.0. It
Mm-hmm.
was imperceptible, right?
Right.
And it just seemed like a kind of, normal pace of change there for a while. It was perceptible, but it didn't seem like earth shattering. And now all of a sudden we've hit this place where the doubling effect was like we went from like half of the pond to like, oh, the whole pond, and oh, we're like spilling out from the pond. This is one
Right.
really big lily pad, right?
Right.
We have that happening with technology right now. And we have that intersecting with a lot of global pressures that are nearly exponential themselves, like climate change, like the global conflicts over, a lot of what's driving things that are happening in the world right now is a fight over whether the United States retains its privileged economic position as the world's reserve currency. So there's a lot of covert and, overt conflict that is happening around that. New alliances are forming. So you have like those are just a few things off the top of my head that are intersecting
Sure.
with the technological changes to create this environment that's just exploding with transformation.
Right.
So creativity. So why creativity? Why is that where I say we have to go? And that is a really, really good question.
Mm-hmm.
So remember that trauma stays lodged often in sensation and in images.
Mm-hmm.
And that means it's actually more stored on the right side of our brains where our creativity is. So then what is the left side of our brains really doing? The left side of our brains is really good at holding a freeze frame. It's really good at crafting what's created in the right side of our brain. So the two hemispheres are meant to work together, but our culture, everything that has kind of like evolved, we can't even begin to find like the perfect starting place, but much of modern culture was born in imperial Rome. So since that time, the culture that has emerged has made grand use of both trauma and the left side of our brains that are so good at just replicating and building what's familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to get out of that. We got to actually go into the unstructured places where the trauma is held and liberate ourselves from that. And we have got to begin to work creatively and innovatively and get out of that freeze frame. Like I didn't make this up. I can recommend a resource for you to learn all about the left and the right hemispheres of the brain and how they function. But essentially, it creates a bit of a delusion, and creativity is the way out of that. And engage chaos is the
So
way out.
does that include what you're talking about? Does that include like PTSD episodes that people have?
The amygdala is very much involved in that. So it's not 100% like a lateralization issue. But
Mm-hmm.
often I feel like we hesitate to go into that more creative place that's been shut down in us because we do hold there more of the imagery of trauma. And it becomes a situation where we're much more comfortable with simply doing what we've always done, like replicating what we've always replicated. because there's a lot that's unprocessed, and unlocking that, and also unlocking the chaos and the creativity, is central to working with the exponential change. So maybe the way I can actually make this more tangible is that in a trauma cycle, you get to a place where you have a hopeful new beginning. We all had that, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm finally gonna whatever.
Right.
And then you get a little bit into it and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it. And then the tension starts to build up inside of you. Are you familiar with that moment where the whatever new thing you're doing starts to make you really anxious?
Yes.
Okay. So that tension is where most people actually repeat the trauma cycle.
So it's like you took all these steps forward. Now you're taking steps back.
Yeah, I call it perilous nostalgia.
Okay.
You got to get back to what's comfortable and familiar for you.
Right.
So if we keep doing that, and at a moment when the world is jumping ahead, the lily pad's getting enormous and moving faster and faster, then we never actually are able to come into the present moment. Because, I there's one expert whose name I'm never going to be able to say right, but I see his ads all the time. And he says that trauma is an illness of not being able to be present in the present moment. So that's what happens when the tension starts to build up. We lose the present moment. We trigger back to what's familiar, and we start the cycle over with a big drama, a big question of drama. Can I get back what I lost? Like, this is also what happens in violent relationships where, you're in the cycle of violence. So what I'm describing as a trauma loop is really an internalized cycle of violence that you carry out in your own life. So it's sustained by the same things that sustain violent relationships. Hopeful new beginning. Yay, this is great. The tension builds up. It's too much to bear. You release the tension. Somebody gets hurt somehow if it's in a relationship. And then there's this big drama where, you're bringing the flowers, or, you're getting the flowers, and the whole thing feels like a, tension, new kind of tension. Can I get back to the hopeful new beginning?
Right.
And we just do this our whole lives, whether we're acting it out in a relationship or we're acting it out by destroying our own dreams. So we never actually have movement. Do you see what I'm saying? There's movement, but no movement.
Right.
So right now, if we keep doing movement, but no movement, we're not going to be equipped. We aren't equipped in that cycle to do what's necessary to deal with the vast, interconnected, exponential and near exponential transformation of the world that is happening, partially because of innovations, but partially because of systems that are perpetuating unsustainable behaviors. They're in their own loop, right? So we have to get out of the loop.
Yes.
That's where creativity becomes a part of it, and also practices of emptiness and impermanence. Like, you've seen where the Buddhist monks build these amazing mandalas out of sand and then wipe them away.
Yes.
A perfect way of thinking about what's required of us in the years ahead. Because what's really going to happen is what we build today will be obsolete so fast. Like, I've heard some people, and I can't remember who I was listening to, but he was saying, I wonder what's going to happen to people who build businesses, and in 3 years' time, they're completely obsolete.
Right. A lot of the .coms found that ending, didn't they?
And it's happening faster and faster and faster, that what's relevant now isn't going to be relevant tomorrow. Right. So like in my own business, I've moved into this process where I have a new production every year. So this is my artwork for my 2024 production, which is like gorgeous. Moving through a portal to something new. There's a star in the middle of it. So following your North Star to move through the portal to something new.
That's great.
So every year I create a new passion path production. And this year is the Redshift Renaissance. so that I'm constantly creating, like I have the solid base of the passion path, but I'm constantly creating for the times that we're living in. And that's how I'm greeting the moment. I'm collaborating with the chaos. I'm reaching into the future. I'm feeling for the contours of what the world is going to need. And I'm building based on what I'm feeling. And that
Well,
means I have to drop all that stuff. I can't be in a trauma loop and do that. This is the new loop. It's a blessing synergy. So you have a trauma synergy and you got to get out. You got to use that point of tension that where you feel the need to discharge, to not discharge and get yourself out of the loop. And I can help people with that. Get yourself out of the loop and get into what I'm calling a blessing synergy, which looks like that. Like following your North Star instead of following your trauma.
well, Rebecca, I just have to tell you right now, I've just had kind of an aha moment, and my eyes are watering
Oh,
because
I thought you-
because of this aha moment, because what you've just described about what you said, your path, your passion path, the foundation stays the same, but each year you're creating something more. You just described the last 7 years of my life since retiring, because I was in the loop for 30 plus years of being a teacher, and I didn't mind it. I loved it because it's what I wanted to do since I was 6 years old. However, the last 5 years were quite the struggle for me because my dad had passed away and things were changing with me, physically, emotionally, and everything else, until I knew that I did not want to teach anymore. But that was so difficult to make that decision to retire, because then what am I? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? That was my whole identity. But the way you're describing it, I was in the loop, and I did not understand that, because in the last 7 years that I have been retired, I have been doing without knowing of what you just described. I had not created Pathways with Patty yet. That did not happen until 2 years ago. But in the last 7 years, I was creating new things, which when I look at it now, because of this aha moment I just had with you that made my eyes all tear up here. Um, I have I'm working on what you're saying of staying in the moment, and not staying in the past. I've broken out of the loop, and all of these things that I've been doing, one has been building up on the other. Because in some respects, I keep thinking, where is all this leading to? Why am I starting this now? Or because I believe in God, and I keep thinking, God, why are you bringing this in? What's the purpose of this supposed to be? But what you just said, oh my gosh, thank you, Rebecca, for that, because that was enlightening.
So you made your way from a trauma loop, from a trauma synergy. Like a trauma synergy is together, we can do more harm.
Mm-hmm.
Together in whatever, like in whatever institution I'm in or with whatever person I'm creating with, together we can do more harm because we're in that loop together.
Well, and
And the
that was
world is in there.
and that's one of the things that I had told myself. If I ever felt like I got to the point where I was not benefiting my students anymore, then it was time for me to get out. And that is ultimately what I felt like what was happening. And because I had always told myself that, because I had seen, as a kid, I saw too many teachers that were just in it because they had to stay a certain amount of years to get their pension. Or I taught with a number of people that because we didn't have health insurance, that's why they stayed. And they were not very good teachers. They were not very nice, and they were not very good teachers. And I always said that was something I never ever wanted to do, because it's not fair to the kids. And that's what finally did it for me, because I knew I know I really wasn't, but I felt, for me, I wasn't giving them my best anymore. And therefore I felt, in a sense, I was hurting them. And that's why I ultimately needed to get out.
Well, and the education system is a giant trauma synergy. I mean, it's a perfect example if you look at what teachers are going through
Yes.
now, where together as an institution, it's, there's more harm for students and more harm for teachers in the environment that has emerged. So it sounds like you got out at the right time, and
Yes.
you created for yourself the center of the blessings energy.
Yes.
So
yes.
the center of the blessings energy is the passion pact that you make with the spirit and with the dream that you have. And that becomes like if you look at that, it's a little bit like the event horizon of a black hole. It becomes like that. It becomes like the event horizon at the center of the black hole, at the center of the galaxy. And all of a sudden there's a whole galaxy that starts forming around this central point, which is your North Star, which is your passion pact, right? So I'm making this sound a lot simpler than it is, because if people could just be like, I'm leaving the trauma synergy, I'm going to be in the blessing synergy. No, it's not easy work.
Right. Yeah.
But that's what you did, is that you traded in something that was becoming for you a trauma synergy.
Yes.
That was that everybody was feeding into that trauma synergy. Okay. So you left that and you created for yourself a new North Star, a passion pact with which for you is something that you're doing with God, as that's what you call the spirit.
Right.
And that is the thing around which you're organizing everything. And it's the thing that allows you to come into the present moment. And it's the thing that allows you to create the mandala and then destroy it in order to move to the next thing.
Wow.
So the word that people need for this next movement is nimble. We've got to be nimble. And trauma, unresolved trauma, causes us to not be nimble. Trauma synergies cause us not to be nimble. We cannot actually move. So we've got to be able to, like, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. We've got to be able to jump over that candlestick.
Yes. Yes.
And that means unsticking ourselves. And that means facing whatever chaos. See, that's what that tension is. That tension is chaos. It's internal chaos that we're afraid to engage. And so we trigger back to the familiar. So that's those teachers that keep going back year after year after year, because they're afraid to engage the chaos of transitioning through that tension to something new. So they're just back to the familiar, back to the familiar, back to the familiar. And they're not very good teachers, because they're being beaten up every day by the choice that they're making and by the system that's not working for them and by the fact that they're not doing their best. Right. So that's an example.
Wow. Wow. That's wow. I know I just keep saying that, but I totally understand that now. I mean, you just shed such a huge light on that concept for me, because at first I wasn't getting it, but then all of a sudden when you started describing what you did and then related to your background here for this, it like all fell into place, exactly what you're talking about. I get it now.
You can see how, like, we can't keep doing the old thing.
No.
We can't keep holding on to what's dead.
Because even though we know it's comfortable, it's not getting us anywhere. We're treading water is all we're doing, and not going anywhere.
It's harming us.
Yes.
And it's making us unable to confront the transitions that are happening now.
Right. Exactly. Well, I know part of my journey the last couple of years is I finally just had to stop watching the news and news related shows, because it was affecting me in a not a very good way. And I feel like I was starting to get stuck. I felt like I was doing stuff, like I just said, but listening to all of that and seeing what it was doing to the people around me, that was making me, I tend to be a bit of an empath. And so I was taking on all their negative energy and all their sadness, and I couldn't do it anymore. And so I made the conscious decision 2 years ago that I would not watch TV until after dinner. And then it's usually things that I have, either like fun shows that I like watching that I would tape, or I would watch a fun movie or something. And I feel like I'm so much more productive now. And I feel like I have a purpose now, not only for my own life, but in helping people create their passion and purpose also. And I feel more in tune with what's happening around me now than I did before.
Well, and I think the news is not there to actually deliver the news. Like much of what's actually, like, all the pieces that you actually need to connect to understand what's happening in the world are not going to be presented to you on the evening news or on, internet news or whatever in a way that allows you to actually understand what those things mean, because everything is kind of reported in a vacuum. It's not contextualized to the broader changes that are happening. So you actually have to go deeper within yourself to find those answers. And I would say that like the next thing that's going to happen, unless something dramatically shifts, like I can't predict the future, but from studying the subject matter, I believe that the next thing that's going to happen is we are going to lose track of what is reality. Like we're so used to having centralized organizations deliver a version of reality to us, whatever version of reality it is that we're drawn to. And with artificial intelligence and the capacity that it has to produce, what people are calling deep fakes, like the next year with the election cycle there and in Mexico, I think reality is going to become really hard to discern. And I actually think that is a good thing, because we are poised at the edge of a transformation in consciousness that, well, actually, we're in the transformation of consciousness that is actually taking us from one sort of epoch in human, behavior and expansion to another. And this next piece of our human journey is very inward turning. So we're not going to actually have much option but to turn within, to begin to discern, to hear, to create, along with our passion pact that, we've made. Like, I think we're going to have the discernment is the word that I'm looking for. By the time the external world can tell us what's true, it'll be too late for us to have made a decision. So we're going to have to actually get beyond the trauma, the biases, the things that are clouding our judgment and our ability to discern, and start discerning life in a much more visceral way, because we will not be able to rely upon the delivery of information to necessarily be reliable. We're already starting to see some of that with the conflict in the Middle East. So
right, exactly. So when someone comes to you and wants to work with you, do you base the length of time that you work with somebody based on whatever their trauma may be or whatever their issues may be, or do you have like a set course that you do, or what is your process?
My process is completely improvised. I don't think there are very many people who would say that confidently or be crazy enough to do it. But I have a lot of experience, and I work with people to find where they are in the process. So my work is not oriented towards trauma, because that's the wrong orientation. We'll be there forever. You can hire me to help you resolve your trauma, and we can stay on resolving your trauma until both of us die, and you can just be rich. Like it's never ending train. So actually my work, the true North Star that's at the center of everything, is we find what it is that you believe you're here to contribute at this moment in history. That could be something as simple as what you want to contribute in your family that's not happening, a dream that you have for your marriage, for your family, for your community. But what is it that you are here to create? What kind of impact are you here to have? And that becomes like our true north for both of us. And we activate that and we start working with that. And once that's activated, that is the path. Like we are connecting, we are like dropping an anchor or marking an X on the treasure that's somewhere in the future. And then we are on that path together. That is your passion path. And it goes where it goes. And I use every skill that I have from everything I've ever developed according to what you need today as we start, once we drop that anchor.
That's very cool. That's very cool. I love the fact that you are confident when you say, you don't know how long the journey is going to be with that person. Because everybody's journey has been different and will be different. And that's what there
is no path of preordained transformation that I can sell with a straight face. And anyone who says they can, I just don't believe it. I tried. I created something called Dream Alchemy, and I will never put it out. And I will never put it out. The only way I could create a path of transformation that was do it yourself was to create a myth that you could step into and follow along, that was a story that was started with your trauma and ended with your transformation. And that meant I had to create visceral experiences, and those visceral experiences would then come alive and become a part of someone's life. And then they would call forth things. And you know what? Those things that were being called forth would not necessarily be right. I'm scrapping the entire 7 doorway process, because at this moment, I am very clear that you cannot step into my myth. You have to step into your myth, and we will create it together. And that's what I'm good at doing, is helping people create the myth of their journey as we go along the way. And we're building, that's the other thing, we're building whatever it is that you want to have in your life. We are actually making it in the physical world. That's the redshift renaissance. No more of this ethereal change that happens here or happens in the spirit realm or whatever, and maybe it comes into being and maybe it doesn't. This is real building of your life, of your family, of your marriage, of your community, of your world. It is about actually changing what's in front of you with changed behavior, with innovative approaches, with whatever is necessary to realize the impact that you're here to realize.
That's powerful stuff. That's all I can say about that. That's powerful. Love it.
Thank you.
Rebecka, what would you say is the best piece of advice anyone's ever given you?
The best piece of advice anyone's ever given me. I'm going to say that my husband gave me the best piece of advice anyone has ever given me. And he continues to do that. So I'm going to plug him a little bit. He does these diamond drop oracles, and they're amazing. They're like one line. And you hear it, and then you're like, uh-oh. I think like that was a crack in my understanding of the world. So one of his diamond drops is to spend time with people who are not on your level. Now, if you really stop and think about that, I just broke your paradigm, or he did, without even being in the room, because most of the advice that's out there is find someone who has accomplished what you want to accomplish and get in the room with them, or find rich people and hang around them to find out what rich people do to be rich, or what it means to be rich, right? And what he's saying is spend time with, be around people who understand the world differently than you do, from every possible level and position that is relevant to what you're doing. Because real change doesn't happen because you glom on to someone who's done something you want to do. Real change happens when you disrupt your completely insulated perspective on the world. And I think that's the best advice anyone has ever given me.
Well, and I can totally relate to that, because when I was doing my student teaching field work, my master teacher had given us an assignment that we had to find a student at the school that we were doing our student teaching, and we had to find a student that had the opposite philosophy of school from what we had. And for me, I mean, I absolutely loved school, and it was just the ultimate, and I was involved in everything. And I'm thinking, oh my God, then that means I got to find a kid that does not like school. And we had to interview these kids if they were, we asked if they could be interviewed. And then the assignment was to find out about that, because to make us a better teacher, because we're not going to have all this classroom full of kids that all love school. And once again, I believe it was God. The very next day I go into school, and there is this student that walks into the office, and right away, I can tell from her mannerisms, her language, everything, she hated school. She did not want to be there. In fact, her goal every day was to see how many classes she could ditch. Oh, I'd never ditch. Anyways, it turned out to be one of the most powerful lessons ever. And the relationship that I actually built with this particular person is a phenomenal story. But what it did for me is exactly what you're saying. It helped me to become a better teacher because I thought about those kids that were there that didn't want to be there. They didn't like school. I wasn't just teaching to the ones that wanted to be there. So it's the same thing. Talk with those people that have a different perspective about the world or whatever it may be. I think that is great advice you can give to anybody, because it's easy to be with like-minded people, or to be with people like you would want to be, but to go with somebody that's totally different from the way you think or feel or whatever, I think you can learn the greatest lessons from that.
Well, and I think I'm that person for a lot of people that that are out there. But I also want to say that my husband is that person. Like, he does dream interpretation. So if you have a powerful dream that, you know, the kind that wakes you up at night and you feel like you have to write it down, he learned dream interpretation from his grandfather in San Juan Chamula, and he's Tzotzil in Celtal. So he has this completely different perspective on what your dream means, whether it's a waking dream or a sleeping dream. Really, he can interpret either. So the two of us together work on these dream interpretations, and we work on expanded versions of his diamond drops. So like right now we're doing one called Coyote Council SEL, which is Coyote Council. If you follow your tail like a kitten, you find scarcity. So we're expanding that into a whole ebook. So we want to be the different perspective that people, you know, in the you know, let's say in the global north, in the more developed countries, we want to be one of those different perspectives that people reach out and receive. Right. Especially his perspective, because one of my passions is to bring his work into the world so that, you know, who gets a seat at the table of ideas, whose ideas connect them to wealth. Like, these are really critical issues that we have to confront right now. So one of the things I'm doing is putting him out there. He calls himself the Chamula shaman because he doesn't have any desire to be famous, and it's a little bit tongue in cheek. So it's with an X, like the Chamula shaman, which so anyway, he doesn't want to talk about the paradox of the name, but which is another one of his wise things. He doesn't reveal everything. But he's one of those voices that I think need to be heard.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. Rebecka, what would you say is your purpose personally and professionally?
I am the person who stands between two worlds and moves people through that transition point. So when I wrote my book, which is called Coming Alive with an exclamation point, I described what I called the domination system. That's not my term. You can get all the research in my book. But I landed on the term the domination system to describe personal and collective trauma systems and define and describe and define what they are. Then I wrote about the process of encountering the passion path and beginning to die out from under those systems. And the third piece is to build a world, whether it's within your own household or in your community or globally, that is set up for flourishing potential. And I would include in that the flourishing potential of the earth. So I'm the person you meet when you're ready to make that transition between worlds, when you're ready to become one of the people who's building a world that's made for the thriving and flourishing of human and planetary potential. So I help you do that work. I help you make the future. I used to talk about history makers. I don't talk about history makers anymore. You're future makers. You're ready to create the solutions that for what's next.
That's awesome. What would you say you're passionate about personally and professionally right now?
What am I passionate about? I am passionate about all of the big interconnected transformations that are happening. Like, I give talks on, you know, what is monetary policy and how does it work? And just all of the, you know, how does that dovetail with AI? And what about this Bitcoin thing? And I just love all of the interconnected points of transformation. So I'm really passionate about that in addition to the work that I do. So I'm actually going to be opening a Facebook group for the Redshift Renaissance. That's going to encompass like reports on the collision between AI and really big shifts in population density that's going to happen over the next few decades as younger generations in Europe and the United States and China are refusing to they're refusing to support the idea that our economy must constantly have a population expansion. And that has consequences. And how does that come together with AI? So that's an example of one of the things that I'm working on now that we're going to be covering in the Redshift Renaissance Facebook group.
Wow, interesting. What would you say is your superpower?
My superpower and my greatest detriment are probably exactly the same. I'm one of these people that like my mind just like can't rest until it's chewed through something.
Yes.
So that made me a really great tax lawyer because you'd be surprised how creative tax law actually is, but I can take some of the most complicated intersections of information and rules and regulations and that kind of thing and turn it into a creative output. And so I spend a lot of time in, learning mode and study mode and grinding, that information in my mind until I come up with something innovative or new or understanding that the world needs. But get that mind applied to the wrong thing. My husband calls it
just can't let it go.
Like my husband and I call it the demons. Like when when one of us is having that, we'll be like, the demons are saying. And then we can talk about it in the third person without it actually being an accusation against the other
there
person.
You go.
Like, if the demons get going, it's an endless sort of it can become an endless sort of paranoid nightmare of trauma triggers. And so combine that with that kind of mind and it can just bad.
Superpower and a curse. I like that.
Yeah.
How would you say that right now you are living your what most people would say, how are you living your best life? I say, how are you living your best dash?
How am I living my best? Well, I would say that the really beautiful focal point in my life right now is my relationship with my husband, and it took a huge amount of work to surmount, the combined trauma, the economic difficulties, the pandemic. We've been together a little over 5 years, and those have been like really hard 5 years. So I would say that is the place where I'm like really living the dream that I've always wanted as we create together the diamond drops, and as we collaborate in the work and as we're starting to do the dream interpretation work together, like that's the real hot spot of yum in my life. I was thinking just this week, like if I reached back in time to tell myself from 6 or 7 years ago what I was going to go through and like what would I offer her to induce her to go through. And I was like, I don't know. But I think that would be the beautiful collaboration that I've built with my husband under the most difficult of circumstances.
Yeah. Well, good for you. Are there any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience?
Let's see. Failure. If nimble is one of the words that you need, failure is the other. Those are the keys to working with the chaotic environment that we're in. Fail fast. Do it, miss it, do it again. Whatever, create, uncreate, like we don't want to be in a cycle that's unnecessarily destructive, but we have to let go. We have to fail and let go. And I had a huge failure last year that I just won't even launch into. It was like a mortal failure that I'm still paying the price on. And that taught me that when we're reaching for a new level, and we have to always be reaching for a new level in this environment, we must fail on purpose. Just build it in, because the faster you fail, the faster you find the path forward.
Wow. That's another aha moment. Boy, Rebecka, I'll tell you what, I just thank you so much for being my guest today, because I can only imagine if I've had as many aha moments with you during this conversation. I do not know how many people that are listening or watching on YouTube right now that the same exact thing is happening to them. Knowing that, what are the ways that people can connect with you?
Well, I only offer one pathway for actually working with me. Completely improvised, bespoke experience. It's one session that determines whether we can go forward or not. And you can book that session on my website. It's called Flourishing Fusion is the session. And my website is very, very simple. thepassionpath.vision. So there's no issues with spelling, very easy to find. thepassionpath.vision. You can get a free gift that shows you all that we've talked about today about the trauma synergy and the blessing synergy, and how you use the tension that you come around to break out of the trauma synergy and into the blessing synergy. You can book the session. You can also, I think through that site under book a session, you can also book dream interpretation, which I do with my husband. So
Awesome.
that's a one-off thing. Also,
excellent. Excellent. Well, for those of you that are new to the podcast, know that that link that Rebecka just told you about, it is in the description. So whether you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, it's in that description, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's also in that one. So all you got to do is hit on that link, and it will put you directly in contact with Rebecka, and you can connect with her and have that conversation. And I once again, Rebecka, I just thank you so much for being here today and being my fascinating guest. It has been wonderful.
Thank you also. You were a great host. You let me tell my story, and you really pulled out the next level. And I think we went on this journey together. So thank you so much for that opportunity. It
has been a journey, and I appreciate that so much. And for those of you out there, if this has been a journey for you, just know that anytime that you listen to one of the podcasts and the many guests that we have here, they are take you on some type of a journey. So subscribe and follow this podcast, invite your family and friends to do the same, and please leave a comment, and I will definitely get back to you. I love to hear your comments and know what you think. And the other thing too is you can also check out my website at www.pathwayswithpatty.org, and you can sign up for a chat with me if you would like to be a guest on the podcast, or just like to talk to me about some other things dealing with rediscovering your passion and purpose. So until we meet again, continue to live your best dash, and know that life's an adventure, and I want you to enjoy the journey, because your life matters. Thank you for joining us today, and may God bless you all.